Hi, welcome to our review on the lymphatic system lab. All right, before we start with the structures and naming the organs that belong to the lymphatic system, we have to review the general functions of the lymphatic system. Most of you probably had an idea of lymphatic system equals immune system, and that is correct. This is the main system where your white blood cells fight microbes, fight pathogens. We have organs that are specific for that, but we also, many times we skip this major function of the lymphatic system, which is return fluids to the blood. In other words, fluid reabsorption. This is extremely important because that's the way how the tissues remain with enough amount of fluid inside. Without the lymphatic system, we will retain fluid and our tissues will swell. So to explain this, because the lymphatic system is made by a network of lymphatic vessels, the main function of those lymphatic vessels is to collect lymph or collect interstitial fluid from the tissues. So to explain first how the lymph is formed, we need to have this general concept that every single cell in your body will need nutrients, will need oxygen, will need water. You can think about a cell like a little human that needs all those things in order to survive. And you should know that many cells that share similar function and they share similar structure, they form tissues. Right? So when we have a lot of these tissues together, all these cells will need oxygen, water, nutrients. For that, we have blood vessels that transport all those nutrients that I just mentioned. We have arteries. So I'm going to draw these actually here. So just give me a second. Imagine these little circles represent tissues and cells. Here, what it will be like a blood vessel. And if you remember, we have arteries. We have veins. Arteries and veins. In order to maintain all this blood supply to the tissues, we have two major organs or two players here in the equation. One is the heart. You should know that the main function of the heart is essentially pumps the blood and delivers the blood to the rest of the body. And we have the lungs. The main function of the lungs will be get oxygen when we breathe and exhale carbon dioxide, which is a waste product every time that we exhale. So knowing that all the blood that the heart pumps travel through the arteries. The blood arrives to the smaller arteries, and then when the arteries become smaller and smaller, they form capillaries. Capillaries is the smallest unit of a blood vessel. In this point, because the blood pressure that the heart generates every time that it pumps, oxygen, water, nutrients, glucose, etc., can get out of the capillary, and especially fluid will enter into the interstitial space. So interstitial space is the space between a cell and a blood vessel. The space that is inside of the cell is called the intracellular space. Everything outside of the cell is called extracellular space. The extracellular space can be divided in intravascular, which is all the fluid that is inside of a blood vessel, and extravascular, which as a synonym is interstitial space. So interstitial space, intravascular space is this space outside of a blood vessel, but outside of the cell. So between those two. So anyway, once we have the fluid, we have all the nutrients in the interstitial space, the cells can take what they need, and they can secrete all waste products. In some point, all the fluid that entered the interstitial space, in one way or another, we need to return that to the blood vessel. So most of that fluid is reabsorbed through the veins. However, we do not reabsorb the entire amount of fluid that enters into the tissue. What I'm trying to say here is, for example, in 24 hours, on average, in a tissue, you will have about 20 liters of fluid entering the interstitial space. Using the vein systems, we will be able to reabsorb 17 liters of fluid. That led us with 3 liters of fluid that are still in the interstitial space. If we do not remove those 3 liters, the tissue will swell, and will have a condition that's called edema. So here, in order to reabsorb those 3 liters of fluid, we use the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is this special system that will reabsorb the remaining fluid that the veins did not reabsorb. So that is one of the major functions of the lymphatic system. Once this interstitial fluid enters a lymphatic capillary, which is the smallest unit of a lymphatic vessel, now the fluid is no longer called interstitial fluid. Now the name changed, and this fluid inside the blood vessel, inside of the lymphatic capillary, is called lymph. The word lymph comes from Latin and means clear. So it's a clear fluid that enters the lymphatic system. Once that fluid is in the lymphatic capillary, it will travel through lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels will become bigger and bigger, and then at some point, all the lymph from the lymphatic system is going to drain in the vena subclavian veins, and then finally in the biggest superior vena cava. So as you can see here, at the end of the pathway, that excessive or extra fluid that the veins originally did not reabsorb are going to enter into the lymphatic system, but at the end of the pathway, lymphatic system is going to drain in the right and left subclavian veins, and therefore superior vena cava. This is a representation of the lymphatic vessels network. This is also that you can apply this to veins. Veins and lymphatics, they will start very little. They're going to start very small. The smallest unit of the lymphatic system is called the lymphatic capillaries. This portion is the one that we just reviewed. Is exactly the place where the fluid from the tissue initially gets reabsorbed by these capillaries. Later, many lymphatic capillaries together will merge and form structures that are a little bit bigger. The name of these structures are the lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels will become bigger when they merge, and they will form lymphatic trunks. And finally, the largest structure of the lymphatic network, lymphatic vessels, is called the lymphatic ducts. We have 2 lymphatic ducts which we're going to review later in this class. But before we do that, I want to explain something else about the lymphatic capillaries in the digestive system, because here the lymph that I just told you that is clear, it might turn a different color. The name of these capillaries in the intestine digestive system, they also receive a different name. So we're going to see that next. Before we move to review the lymphatic ducts, I want to mention that in your digestive system, we have lymphatic capillaries as well, but they receive a special name. They have another name. They're called lacteals. The reason why they're called lacteals is because I mentioned before that lymph from the tissues normally is clear, but here in the digestive system, these lacteals will carry fluid that will have this milky appearance, and this fluid is called chyle. Why this chyle is different than the fluid that we normally have in the other blood vessels and is clear. The reason why this chyle turns white is because it's full or saturated with fat, with lipids and lipid soluble vitamins. Now, the part of the digestive system that will have the majority of these lacteal cells are going to be your small intestine. The reason why, because the small intestine is the portion of the digestive system that is in charge to absorb all the nutrients from your diet. Now, most of the time we can divide or divide the diet components in three categories: proteins, fat or lipids, sugars or carbohydrates. So we are able to absorb in our diet from the intestine into the blood proteins and carbohydrates. Now, of course, these carbohydrates and these proteins, we absorb them after we break them down into the smallest units of each one. But lipids, even though we can break that down into the smallest units, is still they're large particles, large molecules. Those lipids also are non-soluble chemicals. In other words, they do not dissolve in water. So we cannot absorb the lipids from the diet directly into the capillaries, into the blood. Instead, we use, in order to absorb those lipids from the diet, we use the lymphatic system, and specifically the lymphatic capillaries that are in the small intestine, which receive the name of lacteals. Remember, the fat is white, and that's why it turns this interstitial fluid in this milky fluid. If I want to show you here, imagine that this circle will be a small intestine. This portion here that I'm drawing will be the wall, the internal wall of the small intestine. This will be the lumen, or the space inside of your intestine. This is the place where the food is going to be in contact with the mucosa of the small intestine. Here's where reabsorption occurs. Now, I'm going to take just one of these guys here, and I'm going to try to draw it bigger here. So we're going to have something like this. We're going to have here blood vessels, capillaries, if you will, which are extremely small. And then here between, we're going to have lymphatic capillaries, which the name in this case will be lacteals. So all the proteins can be absorbed directly into the blood, into this one. All the carbohydrates can be absorbed directly into this capillary, but the lipids instead will be absorbed into the lacteals. That's why these lacteals become, this fluid becomes kind of milky in appearance. After that is the same. Many of these lacteal cells will merge with others and will become lymphatic vessels, lymphatic trunks, and then they're going to drain in the largest lymphatic ducts, which we're going to review next. We have two major lymphatic ducts. The first one is the right lymphatic duct. This right lymphatic duct, as you can see here in the picture, will drain all this fluid from these portions of your body. That means the right side of the head, the right side of the thorax, the right upper limb, and all of them, all the fluid that is collected by the lymphatic vessels, they're going to, at the end, they're going to merge in the large lymphatic duct. These will finally drain into the right subclavian vein, which later will drain into the vena cava and back into the heart. But it's very important that you know that this right lymphatic duct will not drain the entire right half of your body, but instead it will drain fluid from these specific regions of your body. Second is the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct is the largest one, and it will drain the lymph coming from the remaining portions of the body into the left subclavian vein. So this is important. You know that the right subclavian vein is for the right lymphatic duct. The thoracic duct will drain into the left subclavian vein. So both ducts, they drain in the subclavian veins, one in the right. Now, the thoracic duct, it has a portion that is large. If you look at this picture, this in green represent the lymphatic duct. Now, if you look this portion of the lymphatic duct that is larger, it receives a name that is called a cisterna chyli. And if you remember what I told you, that the lymphatic system starts small and then big, you should know that this cisterna chyli is essentially the space where all the lymphatic trunks are going to merge to form what is the beginning of the thoracic duct. All right, so the thoracic duct essentially begins just beneath the diaphragm in the cisterna chyli. Right, cisterna chyli, as you can imagine, will drain all the fluid that comes from the lower abdomen, pelvis. That means all the organs are in the pelvis. All the fluid from those tissues will drain into the cisterna chyli and the lower limbs. Now, we talk about the lacteal cells. The lacteals, lymphatic vessels. So the lacteals that drain or that absorb the fat from your diet will drain in some point into the cisterna chyli. From there, the fat that you eat in a meal will enter the thoracic duct and finally will drain into the left subclavian vein to finally get into your cardiovascular system. Now we're going to review specific organs and division of the lymphatic system. All right, you should know that in the immune system, we have primary lymphoid organs and secondary lymphoid organs. The primary lymphoid organs are called primary lymphoid organs because this is the place where the white blood cells, the stem cells that make white blood cells are going to be located in those. Thymus is kind of special because this is the place where a specific type of white blood cell that is called the lymphocyte will mature in this thymus. The secondary lymphoid organs are the place where all the mature white blood cells are going to be waiting for bacteria to fight infections. That is the spleen, for example, the lymph nodes, and the lymphoid nodules. So it's important that you know that we have lymph nodes and lymphoid nodules. We're going to see the difference of those later, but just as an anticipation, lymph nodes are all these little bumps or little structures that look like a bean shape. They are kind of between, or they're in specific regions of your body. They're essentially between lymphatic vessels. Depending on the region of the body, they will have different names. For example, all the lymph nodes that we have in the groin or the inguinal regions are going to be called inguinal lymph nodes. The ones that we have in the armpit, axillary lymph nodes, in the neck, cervical lymph nodes. You will see that we have some of them in the intestine. They will be called mesenteric lymph nodes. And importantly, we have some lymph nodes behind the knee in the popliteal region. They're going to be called popliteal lymph nodes. With the bone, what you need to know is that it's in the portion of the red bone marrow where all the stem cells are located. Those stem cells are going to create the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The process of these creation of new cells is called hematopoiesis. And importantly here is what happens with the lymphocytes. We have two types, the B cells and the T cells. I mentioned a few minutes ago that the immature T cells, they will need to go into the thymus in order to mature and become functional. Those immature T cells are called thymocytes, and those, they're not ready to fight. They have to, if you will, they have to be trained in order to finally become mature and be ready to fight infections. The B cells, they develop here in the red marrow, and most of them, they're going to travel to the spleen where they're finally mature, and they wait for bacteria or virus to make antibodies and to fight infections. Let's review the first. This is a gland. It's called the thymus. This thymus is important because, again, the T cells will mature there. If you have a deficiency or underdeveloped thymus, you will be immunosuppressed. So in other words, your immune system will never mature completely, and you will have trouble fighting infections. So this thymus is very important. What is also important is for you is to be able to determine where it's located. This thymus, as the majority of the glands in the body, they will look like fatty tissue, right? They will most of the time will look yellow and like fatty tissue. So what you need to know is the location. First of all, we have this thymus in the thoracic cavity. Remember, the thoracic cavity can be divided in pleural cavity, which is the place where the lungs are located. And then we have here in the middle, the mediastinum. So the mediastinum can be divided in inferior mediastinum, which other name is pericardial cavity, and superior mediastinum. There in the superior mediastinum is the place where the thymus is located. Now, you have to be careful when you review other organs, because if you remember, we have other glands here in the neck. So you have to be careful to make sure that you know the location of the thymus and don't confuse the thymus with the thyroid gland, which is here in the neck. Now let's review the secondary lymphoid organs, the spleen and the lymph nodes. So in this model, you can see where's the location and the name of those lymph nodes. In the armpit, axillary lymph nodes. Here in the neck, cervical lymph nodes. Here in this area that I told you, the mediastinum, mediastinal lymph nodes. We have here the spleen also. Remember, in anatomy, we do not memorize color or structures, because you can see here that most of the time the spleen, we are familiar with this purple organ, but that doesn't mean that always needs to be purple. Instead, you need to memorize anatomy based on the location and general shape. So most of the time, the way that I always keep this straight, at this point you probably know also, we only have one spleen, is in the left part of the body, and it always is kind of besides and behind the stomach. This will be the stomach. The lymph nodes that are in your intestines, they're called mesenteric lymph nodes. Get familiar with this word, mesenteric, because when you review the blood vessels, arteries and veins that supply blood and drain blood to the intestine, they're called mesenteric artery and superior mesenteric vein. So mesenteric is most of the time structures that drain or are related with intestine. That is the name. So in this case, lymph node, they're called mesenteric lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are in the inguinal region, inguinal lymph nodes. If we look at this model here also, we can see here this white structure that is here. That is the representation of the thoracic duct. So keep in mind that thoracic duct will drain into the left subclavian vein, and the right lymphatic duct will drain into the right subclavian vein. The last component of the secondary lymphoid node is the lymphoid nodules. You should know that we have three types of lymphoid nodules: the tonsils, which primarily they're located in the upper respiratory portion, which is the pharynx. We have the mouth or mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. This is important for your digestive system because they receive a specific name. The name of these nodules is the Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches essentially are they look like lymphoid nodes, but they're located in your small intestine. And the main function of these Peyer's patches is to fight bacteria, to fight any pathogens that you ingest in your diet. All right. So if you eat any food that contains bacteria, and if that bacteria is able to pass the acidity of the stomach and reach your small intestine, once those bacteria or those pathogens arrive to the small intestine, the next defense are going to be the lymphoid nodules are in the wall of the intestine. Those are called Peyer's patches. Don't confuse the Peyer's patches with the lacteals vessels. Remember, the lacteals, they are in the small intestines. Those are the smallest capillaries that the intestine use to absorb fat and lipids from your diet. The Peyer's patches are the nodules or lymphoid nodules. They are also in the small intestine, but they are more they're bigger structures than the lacteals. And then finally, we have in the respiratory system the bulk or bronchus-associated lymphoid tissue, which is essentially the same. It just changed the name. Instead of mouth mucosa, this is in the bronchus, the name changed to bulk. In this picture here, we can see the tonsils. Now, the tonsils are important, and most of the time, you probably experience what a sore throat and have an upper respiratory infection in some point in your life. You should know that when you have an infection or when you have a bacteria, the tonsils are going to inflame. They're going to become bigger and swelling. That's the sensation that you have when you have a sore throat. So we have three major tonsils in this area. First, you have to know that this is a lateral view and this is a sagittal cross section. This area that I'm drawing here is the nasal cavity. This area here is the oral cavity. This is the tongue. And you can imagine when you breathe air, and if you have an upper respiratory infection, you will see that bacteria at some point can get in this tissue and this mucosa. And we have here the first tonsil. This is called the pharyngeal tonsil. So the pharyngeal tonsil is this large tonsil that is kind of behind and right at the beginning of the nasopharynx. You need to remember that all this structure here is called the pharynx, and we have three portions of the pharynx. We have the nasopharynx, which is the one that is related with the nasal cavity. We have the oropharynx, which is related with the oral cavity. And then we have the laryngopharynx, which is the one that is related with the larynx, which is this one here. So that will be the laryngopharynx. Now, the pharyngeal tonsils, therefore, they're located here at the beginning of the pharynx, and those gets inflamed and they feel inflamed when you have a sore throat. After that, we have the palatine tonsils. Palatine tonsils are the tonsils that are more in the oropharynx, and they're located here. Of course, this is a sagittal cross-section. You are seeing just one, but you should know there are two. Those are the ones that you can visualize when you ask the patient to say ah, and those are the tonsils you can see in each side of the oral cavity. And then we have one more here, the lingual tonsils. Those are a little bit behind. If you remember, this is the tongue. Every time that you see lingual is referring to the tongue, is this tonsil that is behind or in the more posterior portion of the tongue. Okay, let's practice here what we just learned. You have this picture in your handouts, so make sure you complete these. You will see that the arrows not necessarily are pointing structures of the lymphatic system, and that is the part that I want you to realize that in anatomy, the important part is remember location more than just color and textures. All right, let's begin with the simple one, which will be the lymph nodes. We have here in the armpit, that will be this group, will be the axillary lymph nodes. The ones that are here in the inguinal region, inguinal lymph nodes. The ones that we have in the intestines are the mesenteric lymph nodes. We have some here, so those lymph nodes are called the mediastinal lymph nodes. The ones that we have in the neck, cervical lymph nodes. And here we have a few other things. All right, so let's just begin with this arrow. All right, it's pointing something here like a gland. Now, if you put here thymus, you should know that that is wrong. What we have here is the thyroid gland. Remember what I told you in the past or a few minutes ago, that the thymus is in the mediastinum, superior mediastinum, which is located in the thoracic cavity. In this model, unfortunately, we cannot see the thymus, but if we want to draw it, the thymus will be located more down here, is where the thymus will be. All right. So this is the thyroid gland. Then we have this white stuff here in these two, all right? So this one is the thoracic duct. And the one that we have on the right side, that will be the right lymphatic duct. What else? We have this portion here. This is showing you a muscle between the lungs and between this organ, which is the liver. This muscle is the diaphragm. Diaphragm muscle. We have here behind and a little bit in the sides of the stomach, the spleen. If we look here, we're looking at a portion of the large intestine. You should know that this portion of the large intestine is known as the cecum. And then this arrow is pointing somewhere here and very close to the cecum. That's the place where the appendix be located. I think we cover pretty much everything. So just make sure that when you encounter pictures in anatomy, don't get comfortable just with the colors, especially with this one. If that trick you, that means that you're still applying that. You should know location. You have these also, this picture, in your handouts. So these might look a little bit different than the picture you have in your presentation, but again, in theory, it should be the same. Now, we're going to see here the tonsils. So let's look at the first one. This one here will be the pharyngeal tonsil. The ones that we have, if you are able to find the tongue, which is this one, you should be able to identify the lingual tonsil. Finally, number 2, the one that is besides the tongue, that will be the palatine tonsil. Those palatine tonsils are the ones that we're able to see when we ask the patient to say ah, right? So those here are the palatine tonsil. We have this portion which is called the uvula, but you don't need to know it at this point. The pharyngeal tonsil, if we look at the patient here, it will be behind the uvula in the wall of the pharynx, so it will be behind here. And the lingual tonsil will be more down behind here, the tongue. This will be the tongue.